This is a Hermann Prime commander review. Hermann Prime is the newest wheel commander in Rise of Kingdoms, and has already made a decent amount of noise with his unique poison and interesting kit. And whether you love him or hate him, there's a lot to talk about. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about his skills, what I anticipate is the best overall talent selection for him, what formations you're going to want to best utilize with him, some pairings, and any other information that might help you decide whether Hermann is right for you. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about Hermann's skills. His first skill, an active skill, is a 2000 damage factor at max rank. AoE that hits up to 3 troops. This isn't the flashiest thing in the world, but the real meat of the skill is in the poison. Each time a target is hit by this AoE, you get 2 stacks of poison on the target for 10 seconds. So this means you get 2 stacks on up to 3 targets when you use this skill. Each stack increases the skill damage taken by 3%, meaning that when you hit the target with this, they'll take 6% more skill damage instantly. This means that your secondary commander is going to deal 6% more skill damage, and with the 10-second timer, chances are you're going to have no problem keeping those stacks up just through your passive skill rotation, as long as you're not getting crowd controlled with silences or with any kind of disables that prevent you from gaining rage. So this is going to be 99 times out of 100 a perpetual thing that'll build up, and that means as you build up, you're going to deal more and more damage with a max out of 45% skill damage taken on up to 3 targets if you can keep the field fight going. Individually, it is solid, but it really will shine in groups. If you have multiple people, much like Joe and Prime, using it, it'll snowball a lot more crazily than just a single troop. Next, we have a second skill that gives 20% attack, 20% defense, and 15% march speed. Not much to talk about here. Mobility is good, defense is good, attack is good. I would have liked to see the 20% attack be 20% health, but overall, it's just a pretty solid, decent skill. Great for the field because you get the march speed bonus and helps you be less susceptible to being focused down with the ability to reposition. The third skill is a 20% bonus to AoE skill damage boost while attacking other troops on the map. So this doesn't necessarily work on the garrison because you're not going to technically be on the map. But I may be wrong depending on how the mechanics work. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I wouldn't be surprised if even if it works now, it won't work in the future. But the 20% AoE damage boost is great with Liang, it's great with YSG, it's great with anybody with an AoE. On top of the fact that it buffs his own AoE skill damage. Next, whenever you use an active skill while attacking another troop, they lose 20% defense. This is great for breaking up really tanky infantry marches, because most infantry marches are very heavy on defense and health. And it does a good amount of damage to cavalry too, because cavalry has defense pretty much on most of their marches. So being able to knock that defense out is pretty significant. Lastly, the skill also does 5% bonus damage to infantry at the cost of taking 5% more damage from cavalry. This is a pretty standard one they throw in a lot of these, just to help keep the counters in place. Jadwiga has it, I believe. I believe Amani has it. Several of the commanders have it. So it's not anything new here, and it's not the flashiest thing in the world. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I think it was probably more or less added to help balance him out if they were worried about him being too strong. It's not anything unprecedented, as I said, but it's still a little overall versus the rest of the skill. Last, we have on the fourth skill, the commander's troops take less damage from poisoned troops, which is really nice. You get 1% less damage per poisoned troop, meaning you take up to 15% less damage from your target. So at 15 stacks, like I said, 15% reduced damage taken is great. It gives you a little bit more survivability, although I'm still not completely sold on the survivability, but we'll get to that later. And then whenever the troop launches a basic attack, it has a 10% chance to deal an additional, basically, mini skill of 200 damage factor, but giving 2 more stacks of poison is the big thing. So this is going to be great for debuffing. You get that 10% chance once every 3 seconds, potentially. And even if you're only getting it every once in a while, it helps stack the poison quickly. It also helps punish the swarmers because a basic attack includes counterattacks under most cases. So you're going to definitely have the ability to punish swarmers a little bit. In the field fight, as you're retreating, you can still shoot out that AoE, debuff them, and if your allies can react quickly, they can help save you. Lastly, his expertise is a completely new passive skill, and whenever a troop inflicts 25 stacks of poison, they trigger the active skill at level 5, meaning, of course, with expertise, you automatically have it at level 5. Meaning, whenever you hit 25 levels of poison, you can basically double cast the skill. This is pretty solid. I mean, you get essentially a double skill cast, but it's not anything super game breaking. And it's 25 aggregate stacks from what I understand. So it can trigger if you hit multiple people. It basically gives you an extra skill cast. It's not nearly as good as Joan Prime is, but it's a nice solid option to give a nice little extra burst. And then you get that debuff on more troops. And that debuff is really where Hermann is going to make or break himself in the field. So the intent is good. I would love to see more testing, and of course time will tell, because a lot of times even when we start, there's a lot of testing that shows one thing, and then we find out something else. So as it stands right now, it's an interesting skill with 25 overall stacks, but we will see how well that works out in the long run, especially because there's a lot of survivability concerns with him. Next, let's talk about talents. Hermann's talent tree selection is Archer Versatility Support, which is not nearly the best for the field. Support tree is pretty solid, the Archer tree is middle ground, and the Versatility tree is just bad. So since there isn't really a commander to base it off of, because most viable Archer field commanders are skill tree commanders, I'm going to use a Amanitori, because if we don't use we're not going to be using Versatility anyway. And we're going to be using, obviously this is my Garrison set, so this is just something I set up as a mock talent tree. So overall, the support tree is solid, but not game breaking. You want to have at least one rank of Cage of Thorns if you can, so that 5% march speed debuff helps you stick to enemies. It helps enemies less likely to be able to get away from you. It generally helps you get away, so it increases survivability. And it's just very useful, especially in a talent set where there's not a lot. I'm not a huge fan of full quiver. 3% attack is kind of not as useful. The 1% attack on, or 1% health on archers is useful here. If you wanted to go 1 out of 5 on Cage of Thorns, you could then go 1 here and go 3 out of 4 on Phoenix Tail arrows. You're also able to do that. If you want to forego the speed debuff, that's fine. You can go to 4 out of 4. But I don't really care for this damage factor either. Even if it's a overall 200 damage factor at max rank, a 10% chance is very middling at best, and the slow is going to help you more in the field. Since you typically want to use him in a supporting role with that debuff, the biggest thing is increasing your survivability and increasing your support to allies. So that's where I highly recommend focusing on Cage of Thorns. If you do want to only go in one rank and you don't want to go to Phoenix Tail arrows, I recommend putting health here, and health here. So that gives you an additional 3% health, and you can keep a 2 out of 10 here, 2 out of 5 here, for a 10% march speed debuff when you hit a target with an active skill. Or when you use an active skill, rather. And it targets up to 5 nearby enemy troops, meaning even if you don't hit them with the skill, it says whenever you use an active skill, you can then slow down enemies. And if you have a good commander with him that will keep giving you additional rage, like YSG is probably a good example with that AoE damage boost, you can make some good use of it. But really, most of the time, these trees are not going to get you a lot of value, and that's one of the major knocks on Hermann. But that's just overall the issue with a lot of field commanders. Sometimes you have skills that are good, sometimes you have talents that are good, sometimes you have both and you get great longevity. Devsky comes to mind when you think of that. And sometimes you just don't. And the talent selection here is just not the greatest. And when you look at this, you have gathering speed, which doesn't do much. Garrison commanders, a barbarian troop reduction, 3% less damage when attacking watchtowers, which is only for city attacks. There's just nothing here that really gets you value. unless you want to get the 1% attack or go for the 1.5% health. But as I said, you get better value going here, here, and here, getting 3% health for 3 talent point investments when you go with the standard talent investment that you usually have. With the support tree, you also get less skill damage taken at 9% less skill damage. You have the healing boost, which doesn't really affect him directly, but may affect certain pairings. A 60% march speed bonus for 10 seconds after leaving a building, which is great for mobility. You can also use this in farm nodes if you're in like ruins or altars to quickly reposition. And 9 rage on attacks. And that's where you're going to get most of your value, alongside a 150 rage when you use a skill, and a 50% chance to reduce all incoming damage by 15% for 3 seconds. Those are really the value you get, and some of these others are just about picking up as much stat as you can. 3% health here, 3% more damage that becomes 9% at max rank, and Venomous Sting, which can give you 8% more skill damage by your commander's troop, which is super useful too. But overall, those are really the best selections you can have for talents, and they're honestly fairly weak, and as I said, that's a big knock on him as a commander. So I know what you're saying. Tell me the good news. Well, now that we can talk about formations, you do have some good news. You have good formation versatility with Hermann. Because he's a field commander, you have a lot more forgiving units for selection. For example, if you have good arch armaments and you have arch formation, you can use that, although it's not nearly as useful as using some of the other formations, but it is forgiving. The most popular formations you're going to be using with Hermann are wedge, because the skill damage obviously is very important. You can use triple line for mobility, which I think is great if you want to use a high risk, high reward support style, hopping in and out of nodes, slowing enemies down, and just generally being a nuisance, and then hopping to safety once you do get attacked. Hollow Square is an option if you want to be tanky. You don't get to utilize the specialty inscriptions, however, as most of them are shield boosts, and he carries no shield bonuses on his kit. So unless you're using a secondary commander that boosts shields or gives you a shield, the actual specialty inscriptions are not going to carry for you in the long term for Hollow Square. Of course, the most popular is going to be Wedge due to the fact that it's just so versatile, but that is the case for pretty much every single commander in the game, with the exception of the Arch Formation commanders like Gorgo and anybody who does normal damage. But alternatively to, I still think Triple Line Formation is a great option, and those are going to be the big two you're going to use, are Wedge and Triple Line, and I think Triple Line's really underappreciated. While I would like for Echelon to have been good, the debuff doesn't stack and doesn't get bonuses off of Echelon, because it's buffs to other troops, not debuffs. But you'll still get great utility out of Wedge, you'll get great utility out of Triple Line, and both of them can serve you very well depending on what your playstyle is. Next, let's go over pairings. First, a big disclaimer. Since Hermann is still new, most of these pairings we'll discuss here are theoretical, knowing what his kit is and what his kit needs to succeed, since there's still a lot of testing to do yet, and you really may not know what he may pair with best. Knowing his kit, we can estimate easily what he'll work best with him, but we don't know for certain, just because you never know when you're going to get the next Gorgo Constantine. So these are mostly speculative, but they'll give you very solid options. They're definitely good to the B to B+, even A- to A range, depending on which pairing we're talking about. Since Hermann is very similar to Boudica Prime in use with his debuff and his overall mobility, although much more fragile and less tanky, you will likely see many pairings that are similar to Boudica Prime's best pairings, especially since Boudica Prime is traditionally paired with AoEs. But first, I want to talk about Boudica Prime directly. Much like Joan and William, sometimes when they are commanders that have very similar kits, they fit remarkably well together, and I think Boudica Prime and Hermann are one such pair. Both have great debuffs between Hermann Prime's debuff, and of course Boudica Prime's debuff on her primary skill, which can then stack to a 45% damage taken debuff, and then a 35%, giving you 80% damage taken increased on whatever target you're hitting once you reach max poison stacks, which is absolutely insane. Hermann brings good AoE to help Boudica Prime be a little more resistant to Swarm, while Boudica Prime brings good survivability between her bonuses to normal damage to resist Swarm, and her bonuses to be able to resist control effects, and overall just stay survivable. It makes it an ideal pairing. And I think this is going to be a super underrated pairing for Ruins and Altars, where you can only have one march and you want to build the best of the best. Whereas in the field, when you can have multiple archer marches for players who are maining archers in the field, you probably want to split them up and put them with Liang or YSG or whoever your secondaries are, so that you get two better average pairs instead of one high ceiling pair. Returning to other pairings, you also have some other options. If you want to go full damage, of course, Liang is the first name that comes to mind. Between his own ridiculously high damage AoE and them reducing their skill damage dealt, you also get the double debuff that way, although it's less significant than increasing skill damage taken because your team is less able to take advantage of it. He gives some decent health with 30% health and survivability because of that, and dealing 5 or 20% more skill damage on Liang, as well as the additional bonus of 20% more AoE skill damage. You get 40% more skill damage on their double AoE, which has to be respected, but it does come with the downside and risk of being focused because people will know Hermann is pretty fragile, and similarly they'll know that Liang is pretty fragile. And I might actually recommend you putting Liang first, even though that's going to draw some more attention. You have the skill tree, and you can get a lot more utility out of the skill tree than you can with Hermann Prime in his support tree. The other thing to remember is an active skill. You can use the Marquee bonus, which increases your damage dealt by 10%, which you can then take advantage on the debuff and just keep these buffs, debuffs rolling, and just have an overwhelming amount of things going on, which is super great. Similarly, if you want to use a more free-to-play friendly option for players who have been playing for a long time, YSG would also work in this capacity, although it would be even more weak to Swarm than Hermann Liang would be. And it puts out insane amounts of AoE damage with that 50% skill damage boost. Lastly, for those who are looking for a more budget-friendly build with a double AoE without maxing and are a newer player or a player who's more established, if you use Nebu, you can make advantage of that, especially considering that you can not use his third skill and run him as 5-5-1-5 in the field and get essentially the same level as having him fully expertised, with the exception, of course, of a little bit of extra damage factor with the additional damage factor of the single target. You still get a lot of great value. You get good mobility with his march speed, 15% march speed, a 30% defense boost, which isn't health but is good, and a 15% damage boost, which isn't quite as good as the 20% damage Liang gets. And you miss out on the extra targets, but you also have a 10% chance to knock the target's rage down, which is an additional support option, which I think is really underappreciated as well. These are the pairings I think are most common, or going to be anticipated as most common. I'm sure there will be the next Gorgo Constantine that comes out, where a commander comes out of nowhere with a relic or with some other option and just becomes ridiculously good with Hermann. Just looking at his kit, there's just something that's going to sync up with something else. But overall, these are the options that are also going to give you very solid short-term, if not great long-term options, especially with Boudica Prime if you're planning on using a single archer march, or if you're planning on using a Ruins or Altars march where you can only have one march in the field in the area you're fighting in. So where is Hermann Prime going to fall in the meta? So Hermann Prime is in an interesting spot. I think he's great for the field, and I very much feel like he's similar to Joan, just with less crazy going on with the recast. That being that he puts out good damage, has a good support buff, in this case for him he's a debuff, has good mobility, good offensive stats to mid defense, but lacks health, lacks survivability, and really lacks the damage output and sustainability that a commander pairing like Boudica would have, or like Nevsky would have when you're talking about Joan. So it's going to be a very similar niche, just with less damage burst and more damage sustain with the debuffs. I think he's going to make a great option for players who love to play support. because the stacking debuff is going to really, really help you push, especially if you can get everybody in the field to have 1/3 of their marches be Hermann Prime and you can hit targets. These stacking debuffs are going to make your Nevskis hit harder. They're going to make every commander hit harder, which means even if you are a T4 player with all purple gear, you are doing the same amount of support as somebody who's a 100 million power player with a full gold set, because the debuff doesn't care about your equipment. The debuff doesn't care about anything other than if you have that skill maxed and if you're getting the passive triggers. So this is a commander I think is going to be amazing for free-to-play players, and that you can probably get away with not having maxed while also being useful, because the expertise is nice for the extra skill cast, but you're only talking about one extra 2,000 damage factor skill cast. And then the reduced damage is super useful. I recommend you getting. The AoE skill damage is useful, but if you end up fully opening after the first skill and you get 5 something, 5/5, or even if you want an expertise, you're going to have variety and time will tell. I do recommend maxing if you are planning on playing support, but if you are not an archer main and you aren't planning on playing supports, Hermann might not be the commander for you, and that's fine, because he fits his own niche, and there are plenty of other damage dealers, there's plenty of other solid garrison options in the archer meta. So this gives quite possibly a unique playstyle to a playstyle that really hasn't. With the exception of Tamiris, you haven't really had great supporting marches where you support your allies through debuffs or buffs, whereas more you support your own damage through passive skills with archer commanders. So this is a unique avenue that I think is going to be very fortunate for players to have and very useful, but it's not going to be for your average player if you are not an archer main. So it's going to be right in the middle of not quite a must-have for everyone, but definitely not something you should sleep on if you're an archer main. Very much similar to William, I would say, or Joan, like as I said, because both of them are super useful for cavalry, but might not be the best investment if you're not a cavalry player. So at the end of the day, the decision is going to be yours. If you already have Boudica Prime, you probably don't need Hermann Prime, just because Boudica Prime does very similar thing, is a little tankier, pairs a little bit better with YSG, pairs about the same with Liang, with the exception of the fact that Liang can now take this extra AoE skill damage bonus from Hermann, but I think you'll get more consistent results with Boudica Prime because of survivability. But I do think he's going to have a very specific niche in the field support meta, and I'm excited to see where he ends up landing in that regard. But with that, we'll wrap up our discussion on Hermann Prime. I'm definitely excited to see where the pairings come out, because as it stands right now, there's not a lot of super strong pairings, and it would really do him a lot of good in the viability department to have a pairing that's truly perfect for him, much like Jan is with Hera, and Gorgo is with Hera, and Constantine is with Gorgo. And while that is a garrison meta thing, it is definitely still applicable for the field meta, where you need a commander that is a perfect synchronization with you. And I really think that Boudica Prime could be that for most players, but unfortunately it's going to potentially tear your double Archer Field March apart, whereas now you're going to be forced to have the one really good Archer March, and then a not so good Archer March as your secondary march for players who are planning on building multiple field archers. But let me know what you think. Do you think he's going to be the next Joan Prime? Or do you think he's going to be a little middling in the overall meta? Let me know in the comments. If you want me to cover another commander in a commander review, let me know down there as well, because those recommendations often become future video topics. And as always, good luck, fight well, and I will see you on the battlefield.